That's right.
And he's with us now, Congressman Dr. Rob Wittman, 1st District Republican, Virginia. Rob, great to have you with us.
John, great to be with you, and good morning, Martha.
Good morning.
Remember that story that you told me, John? Do you have to take the garbage out?
And it's still true today, John. When I came home last night, Catherine said, hey, by the way, not only the trash you have to take out, but would you please go and feed the dogs? And of course, the proper answer to any question like that is yes, dear. So.
It's a humbling experience to go home every night. You got to take out the garbage. Okay, Rob, I want to get to a couple things here that are pretty big. Let's start with yesterday. Durham, who is the chief lead prosecutor in Connecticut, has now turned the Russian hoax, I guess, investigation into a criminal investigation. Congressman Wittman, that's a pretty big deal, right?
It is. It's a big deal in that as Durham looks at the information both there in the FBI and conditions surrounding operations in the FBI, if you're going to expand it to a criminal investigation, then what it says is that there's at least some information that leads you or leads him as a prosecutor to have some suspicions that there could be criminal misconduct there. It doesn't say that there is, but it just says that they've expanded their inquiry to look into that. And anytime you move from just a simple probe of operations into a criminal probe, then that is significant. So I think it says a lot about potentially what Durham is finding in this investigation.
All right, Congressman, you were one of the first ones to get on the air, and really you were really upset about not having the opportunity to see any of the transcripts in this so-called impeachment inquiry. Yesterday, there was a group of Republicans that tried to get into the hearing. They made a scene in the basement. Morgan Griffiths was on Wednesday. I've never heard him so upset. You know, he's kind of even-tempered. He was really upset. We had Riggleman on yesterday, your colleague. He couldn't believe what was going on. When you go to your Democratic colleagues and say, what are you guys doing? How come we can't see what's going on, and all they're doing is leaking out the little pieces that they want to be the media narrative that day? What do they say to you, Congressman?
Well, John, their response is, all you all have to do is to complain about process, but process matters. And I asked them, I said, if the shoe were on the other foot, if this was a Democrat president and this is what Republicans were doing, what would you be saying? I suspect you'd be saying the same thing, that due process does matter, that having access to these transcripts does matter. John, there has now been over 70 hours of testimony, all of that extraordinarily important because members of Congress have to know what's going on if we face a decision on articles of impeachment. And the bottom line is this: in every other previous modern-day presidential impeachment proceeding, both with President Clinton and President Nixon, there was an impeachment inquiry resolution that came before the House that set the rules to protect the minority, which is key in this, and allow the president counsel to at least come in and listen to the testimony so that they can defend themselves. This is not happening here. And this excuse about saying, well, the rules allow us to do this, doesn't make it right. And by the way, Republicans voted against those rules. And they said, well, those are the rules that you all put in place in 2015. I believe that they were rules that do not allow for the minority to be able to do the things necessary to be an active part in this process. And yes, there are Republicans on the Intelligence Committee that are there. The difficulty is that since you can't get a written transcript, and they said, well, the Republicans there are hearing this, and you can go and talk to them. I'm like, well, nobody there can recall the full extent of this. There's another difference, too, in that testimony means something, not just on the words on the page, but how it's presented. All those things are critical. And the bottom line is this, is we are a nation that places at the highest level of value transparency, fairness, and due process. And none of that is happening here. And the Democrats say, oh, well, don't worry about it. You'll get the transcripts sometime in the future. There'll be public hearings sometimes in the future, but they never tell us when that's going to be. So it's kind of like, well, don't worry about it. It's going to happen. I I am beside myself. This is unbelievable that this is happening in our country. And John, the bottom line is we can do better than this. Mm-hmm. And I don't care what the rules are now. I don't care what the excuses they make and say, all you're doing is complaining about process. The American people look at this and go, wow, how are we going down this road? And unless you are just so entrenched in your viewpoint that this situation doesn't have an impact, it does have an impact, and it has an impact not only now but in the future. You can imagine, and there will be one day a Republican-controlled Congress and a Democrat president. If the tables were to be turned, I know that folks on the other side would be just beside themselves. And the problem is because of this lack of transparency, fairness, and due process, what happens is this sets the cycle now potentially when we do have a Democrat president and a Republican Congress, and that's not where this nation needs to be.
All right, Rob Wittman, unbelievable. Let me just ask you one more question as it relates to your colleagues, and then we're going to go to a few words from our sponsors and talk about Syria when I get back. But who is your I forget his name. Who is the chairman of your subcommittee now on sea power readiness?
Joe Courtney from the state of Connecticut. And
you have a great relationship with him, as I understand it. That's kind of the buzz in the Capitol is you and Joe really get along good, and you work together on that subcommittee. It's very important. It's got a lot of power, and you guys have a fabulous relationship. So when you talk to Joe about this, what does he say? The same thing? He just says, well, it's just process?
Well, most of the conversations Joe and I have are about armed services things. And listen, I think he looks at this and sees that this is potentially one of the most impactful decisions that Congress will ever have to make. And I think he wants a process that's transparent, that's fair, and that has due process. So, and listen, I know that, there's obviously internal pressure within his party on those efforts, but I think Joe is a very thoughtful and reasonable person, and I know that he wants this fairness and this due process. The key is when, if you keep saying, hey, it's going to happen, when is it going to happen?
Right.
And all this information that is now piling up, the hours and hours of testimony, if you don't have a chance to be able to go through and read that as it gets into whatever unfolds, and they haven't determined that the Republicans will even have a role in whatever open hearings are there. If we can't subpoena witnesses, then it'll still be only the majority calling witnesses. If the president can't have counsel there, it means that you aren't able to tell the other side of the story. So even if you have those open hearings, there still has to be an element of fairness there. And listen, I think, I don't want to speak for Joe, but I think that he believes firmly in those elements. And I believe that he, in his conversations with leadership there, will say, hey, listen, first of all, it needs to be occurring now, but there needs to be clear rules to protect the minority and to allow the president to have counsel there to defend himself. That's just basic due process. And anybody that says no, that shouldn't occur, I think is advocating for the wrong things and the elements of what are not indicative of what our nation is all about.
We're live, Washington, D.C. Steve Bannon, headquarters, War Room, Impeachment, Episode 5 coming up, 9 a.m. Don't miss it. If you're not around for it, you can get it on our YouTube page later on today. Just go to johnfredericksradio.com and our YouTube page. You get it there. We're with Rob Wittman. Rob is a Republican congressman, Dr. Wittman from the 1st District in Virginia. That's the Central Virginia area. He's a Republican. He's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Sea Power Readiness, and he's with us. Now, Dr. Wittman, let me ask you this. Are there any Republicans, before we get to Syria, any Republicans that you've talked to in the House that could vote right now, could vote for impeachment when the articles come down?
I am aware of. Now, I haven't talked to everyone there, but I think as we look at the information that is before us, you've heard from person after person after person that says that it doesn't rise anywhere near the level of what is directed, in Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution just doesn't get there. So I don't know of anybody. I mean, there have been some people that have been critical of the president, but I haven't heard of anybody saying that they would vote in favor of anything that would come into articles of impeachment.
All right, let's get to Syria. The president yesterday making a speech from the White House on his Syria plan. He basically claimed victory, said we're getting out, but we're still keeping some troops there to protect the oil fields. And he said there's a ceasefire and the Kurds are going to be protected. I know you're very aware of what's going on in Syria based on your ranking member position on that committee, and you get a lot of confidential intel, obviously, that we don't have that's classified. What is your position on Syria now?
Well, listen, I'm glad that we are in a ceasefire. One of my big concerns, John, is Turkey. Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey is an ally. For the last 15 years, they've been moving, I think, further and further out of the NATO orbit, and right now they are moving much closer into the Russian orbit. I have deep concerns about that. There's also, I think, challenges left in Syria. First of all, you have areas there that are, for the most part, governed by opposition forces. So Bashar Assad, has the area around Damascus, but essentially once you get outside of that, there are a number of various groups that have control there. Some of those clearly do not have a U.S. interest in mind. Some of them are associated with ISIS or ISIS-type terrorist groups there. All of those things concern me, and my concern is the long-term stability of the area. Listen, the Middle East, has almost on a daily basis issues with security. All of those things can directly impact the United States. The question for us long-term, and I know we've moved our forces into Iraq, but the question long-term is, how do we make sure that the region remain stable? How do we make sure that we counter the continued effort by Iran to grow influence into that area? And of course, and they are at odds with Saudi Arabia, so it goes back to the Shia-Sunni divide and constant effort there for either Sunni interest or Shia interest to dominate in the region. That's a continued dynamic that we have to be aware of. But the concern is when you have lack of security and lack of governance in areas, that's the perfect conditions for these terrorist groups to come in, regenerate themselves, and then perpetrate harm on the United States and its allies. That's my number one concern. And as I look at the policies that are being pursued, I want to make sure that we are doing that. I think the president gets that. The key is how will this ceasefire turn out? I have to say I'm fairly skeptical of ceasefires there in Syria because we've seen previous ceasefires have not been followed, and the key is going to be, what does Turkey do in the area to at least not be part of any potential unrest that breaks out after this. So I think the challenge for us right now is what do we do with an ally, Turkey, that moves away from, right, I think, NATO interest and U.S. interest, and then what do we do to make sure that area remain secure? Listen, those issues are tremendously complex. I applaud the president for getting this negotiated ceasefire, a long-term negotiated ceasefire. The key is going to be in the long run is what does that result in, right, overall with stability in the region.
And it sounds like there's got to be a reassessment of Turkey's position and role in NATO. And we'll talk about that when you're on again, Congressman Wittman. That's a long-term plan that, as you said, they're in NATO, they're an ally, but they're moving into the Assad-Putin orbit. So you guys are going to have to deal with that. Hey, Congressman, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you, John. Listen, thanks again. Give my best to the Fräulein and tell Joseph keep playing hard. So
thank you, Rob Wittman.
Thanks,
I know